28 years ago, the release of When Harry Met Sally dealt with one thorny issue: whether men and women could really be just friends. That question may still be up in the air, but now we're being forced to confront a more fundamental question: whether men can really become women. America's in the midst of what's been called a transgender moment. Not long ago, most Americans had never heard of transgender identity, but within the space of a year, it became a cause claiming the mantle of civil rights. A discordant gender identity is said to represent who the person really is, by contrast with the sex assigned at birth. And therefore, any failure to accept and support a transgender identity amounts to bigotry. We are told that not treating people as the gender they claim to be is discriminatory. But is it true that a boy could be trapped in a girl's body? Is our sex merely assigned? Can modern medicine really reassign sex? What's the most loving and helpful response to someone experiencing gender dysphoria? And should our laws accept and enforce a subjective notion of gender identity? These shouldn't be difficult questions. In the late 1970s, Dr. Paul Mchugh thought he had convinced the vast majority of medical professionals not to go along with bold claims about sex and gender that were being advanced by some of his colleagues. Mchugh received a world-class education at Harvard College and at Harvard Medical School. And then as chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical School and psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital, he had put a stop to sex reassignment surgeries at that facility back in 1979. Many other medical centers across the country followed the elite Johns Hopkins. But recent years have brought a resurgence of these procedures, not in light of new scientific evidence, mind you, but under the pressure of ideology. Now, the people increasingly in the spotlight of the transgender moment are children. In 2007, Boston Children's Hospital became, quote, the first major program in the United States to focus on transgender children, end quote, as its website brags. A decade later, so today, 2017, more than 45 pediatric gender clinics have opened their doors to our nation's children. Parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Never mind that the best studies on gender dysphoria, the studies that even transgender activists themselves cite, show that somewhere between 80 and 95% of children who experience a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. Never mind that transitioning treatment has not been shown to reduce the extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts among people who identify as transgender. Suicide attempts among people who identify as transgender are 41%, compared to 4.6% of the general population, so 10 times a greater likelihood for suicide attempt. And never mind that people who have had transition surgery are 19 times more likely than average to die by suicide. These statistics should be enough to halt the recent headlong rush into transitioning and prompt us to find more effective ways to prevent these tragic outcomes. Most of all, we shouldn't be encouraging children to transition or making heroes and role models out of those who have done so. So in my forthcoming book, I've just finished going through the edits from the publisher, so they're now killing trees and printing books as we speak. And it'll be on sale in February. But in that book, I argue that Dr. Mchugh got it right, that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality and of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. Biology isn't bigotry. And so in that book and in this morning's lecture, I'm going to try to offer a nuanced vision of human embodiment. I'm going to try to give a balanced approach to some of the policy issues, and then a sober and honest survey of the human costs of getting human nature wrong. The challenge for this morning is that I have 45 minutes to summarize a 400-page book. And then obviously we're going to leave 45 minutes for your questions, and perhaps I'll call on Sharif to give answers. That's how these things normally work. So what I want to do is this is going to come in multi-parts. And I want to start with some of the claims made by transgender activists. And the first thing to highlight is that the vast majority of people aren't activists of any sort, including people who have gender dysphoria and people who identify as transgender. And so what who I'm referring to in this first section, it's not people who identify as transgender in general. It's not people who suffer from gender dysphoria in general. It's specifically to transgender activists. Whether they identify as transgender or cisgender doesn't matter. If they bought into the ideology and the worldview, I just want to report on what they claim, just to kind of set the table in terms of what's happening. All right, so first, transgender ontology, which is just a big word for what they believe is real. People say that we live in a post-metaphysical era, that the modern world has rejected metaphysics. That's not quite true. What we've done is we've just replaced one way of thinking about metaphysics with another way. And so at the heart of the transgender moment are radical ideas about the human person, radical ideas about anthropology. And in particular, they claim that people are who they claim to be, regardless of any contrary evidence. A transgender boy is a boy, not merely a girl who identifies as a boy. And that's a radical shift within the past 5 to 10 years. As I was looking at previous versions of the Human Rights Campaign website and of documents that they had put out, they used to acknowledge that transgender identity was a boy who identifies as a girl, a man who identifies as a woman. And within the past 5 years, they changed that language, including a booklet that they make for journalists, to say that it's offensive to refer to someone who identifies as transgender as identifying as the opposite sex. They actually are the opposite sex. And now it's understandable why activists would make these claims. An argument about transgender identities will be much more persuasive if it concerns who someone is and not merely how someone identifies. And so the rhetoric of the transgender moment drips with ontological assertions. People are the gender they prefer to be. What's remarkable is that transgender activists don't refer to this as a philosophical conviction or a metaphysical conviction or, God forbid, a religious conviction. They claim it's a scientific and medical reality. So I want to read you a quote from Dr. Deanna Adkins, professor at Duke University School of Medicine and director of the Duke Center for Child and Adolescent Gender Care, which opened 2 years ago. This is a quote that she put forward in an affidavit to the U.S. District Court of North Carolina, where she was an expert witness against HB 2, the North Carolina bill that was known as the bathroom bill. She says, quote, "From a medical perspective, the appropriate determinant of sex is gender identity. It is counter to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics to override gender identity for the purposes of classifying someone as male or female," end quote. That's a radical claim from a professor of medicine at one of our most elite medical schools in the nation. It's contrary to medical science to use chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs, genitalia, or secondary sex characteristics. I thought that was medical science. Now, this viewpoint that's now made its way into our nation's courts has been infiltrating our nation's schools. And by the time I get to the end of the lecture, I'll talk about the Dear Colleague letter that went out a year ago from the Obama administration, which on its surface was about bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, dorm rooms. But really, there's an ideological component to this. And some of you look young enough that you actually might have been victims of this when you were in grade school or high school. So I want to show you, this is my first attempt at using PowerPoint, which I did not make. So I think, here's the genderbread person. And if you notice, at the corner, it says version 3.3. So this is the third version of the genderbread person. And it's, if you see the next thing, it's pronounced metrosexual. That's where you can find this. It's at a website there. Okay, so what they argue is that there are 5 different characteristics to human identity. And they're using this with grade school children, children K through 5. And they're being taught that there is gender identity, which is, quote, how you in your head define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. The chart there, it's the yellow, or it's the top one, the blue set of arrows. It lists 4, quote, of infinite possibilities. There's womanness, manness, two-spirit, and genderqueer. But those are just 4 of the infinite possibilities. There's also gender expression, which also exists along a continuum, the way you present gender through your actions, dress, demeanor. This can be feminine or masculine, butch, femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. Then they have something that they call biological sex. That was a no-no, and we'll come back to this. Biological sex, they define the physical characteristics you're born with and develop, including genitalia, body shape, voice pitch, body hair, hormones, chromosomes, etc. And then they have 2 components for sexual orientation. They have who you're sexually attracted to and who you're romantically attracted to. And the options, and this struck me as terribly binary, the options are woman, females, femininity, or men, males, masculinity. So remarkably, when it comes to sexual orientation, they buy into the gender binary. Just strikes me as out of date. It struck many other people as out of date as well. And so we now have the gender unicorn. Now, this is, of course, a mythical creature, which isn't surprising that that's what they replaced the genderbread person with. And the complaints here was that the genderbread person looked too much like a man. And also, you'll notice that we now have something called sex assigned at birth. Right? Even version 3 of the genderbread person, if I can flip back to that, you'll notice that it has biological sex, and it locates it in the reproductive area of the genderbread person. Now we have something known as sex assigned at birth. This is what's being taught to our nation's children. This is the ideology into which they're being indoctrinated. That they have 5 different, if you go back to the genderbread person, 5, in this case only 4. No, there are 5 here too. 5 different spectra, on which they can identify their identity. Their gender identity, their gender expression, their sex assigned at birth, who they're physically attracted to, and who they're emotionally attracted to. Just so you're not staring at that the entire time, I'll go back to the beginning. So that's the ontology. That's the set of beliefs about the human person, the anthropology that is behind many of the activists' claims. Now, what does transgender medicine look like? And here I want to focus on what's known as the standard of care for children and adolescents with gender dysphoria. It's a 4-part standard of care. And the first step is social transition for children as young as age 3 who are persistent, insistent, and consistent in asserting that their gender identity is discordant with their, quote, sex assigned at birth. What social transition looks like is this is where you will give a child, again, as young as 3, a new wardrobe, a new name, refer to them by new pronouns, give them access to a new bathroom, locker room, sports team, dorm room, hotel room, everything. So everything that you would be doing based upon sex, you would now do based upon gender identity to help transition your child when he or she at age 3, 4, or 5 has a gender identity conflict. Second, as a child approaches puberty, so this is at age 8, 9, 10, you're supposed to administer puberty-blocking drugs to your child to prevent them from going through puberty in the, quote, wrong body. And the argument here is that if a child develops distinctively masculine or feminine bodily characteristics when they're actually the opposite sex, it'll lead to exacerbate that gender dysphoria and will make them more likely to commit suicide. This is what parents are being told at these 45 pediatric gender clinics. third step is around age 16, although activists are currently arguing to lower the age of this. Cross-sex hormones should be administered. And the idea behind this, and the reason why they want to lower the age, is that you need to commence and mimic pubertal development of the other sex's body. So that if you were a boy, you were placed on puberty-blocking drugs at age 10, all of your friends are now developing. They're going through puberty, but you're not because you are having your development artificially blocked. That you should, at some point, commence puberty, but of the opposite sex. And so they'll administer estrogen to boys and testosterone to girls. And then fourth and finally, at age 18, they recommend sex reassignment surgery, where you can have top or bottom or both surgery. I won't get into the gory details, they are in the book. But various surgical procedures to remove primary and secondary sexual characteristics, and then using plastic surgery to try to artificially create appendages that would mimic the opposite sex's body. None of these procedures are FDA approved. All of them entail the usage of FDA-approved drugs and devices for off-label purposes. So there is a drug that exists to treat what's known as precocious puberty, when children as young as 6, 7, or 8 start going through puberty too early, and it's used to delay puberty to a biologically age-appropriate time, age 9, 10, 11, 12, something like that. They're now using that drug that was developed and tested to delay puberty until an age-appropriate time to delay puberty indefinitely. And they're telling parents that this is safe and that it's fully reversible. We'll get back to those claims later. So that's transgender medicine. Let me say a quick word about transgender policy. Transgender policy, I just want to focus on 4 basic parts. First is the lessons that children will be taught in school, frequently under an anti-bullying regime. And it's really to say that you can't dissent from the worldview in which the gender-bred person and the gender unicorn are absolute truth. That's what's being taught. It's a new form of catechism class, where the catechism is the gender unicorn. Second, it's to do any sex-specific program or facility on the basis of gender identity rather than biology. Biology here is understood to be bigotry, and so whether you have male and female bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, dorms, showers, that's all to be done on the basis of the student's self-declared gender identity rather than biology. Third is to start prohibiting, quote, misgendering of people. And so in New York City, you can be fined up to $250,000 for intentionally using the wrong pronouns when addressing someone or talking about someone. So even if you're just talking about Caitlyn Jenner behind his back, if you say his instead of her, that can be penalized. And then fourth, it's the mandating of certain medical procedures and subsidies to pay for them. So most people know about the Dear Colleague letter that the Obama administration put out that covered access to sex-specific facilities. Most people know about the HHS Obamacare contraception mandate. Not nearly as many people know about the HHS Obamacare transgender mandate. In the last year of the Obama administration, the Department of Health and Human Services redefined the word sex to mean gender identity, where Obamacare had prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in the coverage and delivery of medical procedures. They were now interpreting that to mean a prohibition on the basis of gender identity, discrimination on the basis of gender identity for both the provision of medical services and the payment of medical services. This meant that every healthcare plan regulated by Obamacare would have to cover sex reassignment procedures, and every relevant physician would have to perform them. If you are an endocrinologist that does hormone therapies for someone that has a deficient level of testosterone or estrogen, you would now have to provide hormone therapy for people who wanted to transition. If you were a surgeon who performed hysterectomies or mastectomies because of cancerous uteruses or because of breast cancer, you would now have to perform a hysterectomy or breast removal surgery, mastectomy, on a woman who wanted to become a man. These regulations had no exemptions for religious liberty, for the rights of conscience, or simply for best medical practice. Many of these physicians simply think that the reason they went into endocrinology or went into surgery was not to be doing sex reassignment. And they don't think it's a particularly good form of medicine. But they were told they would have to perform it. If they did it for any medically indicated reason, they'd have to do it for transgender reassignment purposes, and that all healthcare plans regulated under Obamacare would have to pay for it. This would have been the Little Sisters of the Poor and Hobby Lobby, literally on steroids. Thankfully, on New Year's Eve, just before midnight, this regulation was going to go into effect on January 1st of 2017. A federal judge struck it down as being contrary to law. The actual law says no discrimination on the basis of sex. And the Obama people had just redefined the word sex to mean gender identity. Lots of words have been redefined lately. Okay, so that's all I want to say for now about the policy issues. Let me mention a little bit about the philosophical contradictions here. Because what I want to try to, I'm not a medical doctor. They referred to me as Dr. Anderson. I'm a PhD. If you have physical problems, don't see me. If you have metaphysical problems, see Sharif. So what I want to highlight are some of the philosophical contradictions that lie, that are lurking just underneath the transgender worldview. And again, I want to highlight many individual people with gender dysphoria are fully aware of these contradictions, which is why they don't believe them. And if you talk to people suffering from gender dysphoria, they'll say, I know I'm a man, but I don't feel comfortable in my body. And they want to find medical assistance to help them feel comfortable in their body. So there are many people in our country who are being disserved by transgender activists because they know that their feelings and their thoughts are not in line with reality, and they want medical assistance to help them align their feelings and their thoughts with bodily reality. So what I'm saying here, again, it's directed at the activist. It's not directed at anyone that happens to have gender dysphoria or who happens to identify as transgender. Many of them are simply doing the best they can to cope with a debilitating illness. All right, so as I see it, the transgender worldview combines a new form of the ancient philosophy of Gnosticism, in which the real self is something other than a material body, while at the same time embracing materialism, in which nothing but material bodies exist. It relies on rigid sex stereotypes in which girls play with dolls and boys play with trucks, yet insists that gender is purely a social construct, and thus that there are no meaningful differences between man and woman, all the while insisting that gender identity is real and meaningful, but human embodiment is not. It embraces radical expressive individualism, where people should be free to do whatever they want to do and define the truth however they want to define it, but it enforces a ruthless paternalism to coerce anyone who dares dissent from transgender ideology. So here are a host of questions that you can think about, that you can ask your friends and roommates if they have bought into this ideology. If gender is a social construct, how can gender identity be innate and immutable? That is, how can one's identity with a social construct be determined by biology in the womb? How can one's identity be unchangeable, be immutable with respect to an ever-changing social construct? How could I be trapped in the wrong social construct? The challenges to those who embrace a transgender worldview is to offer a meaningful definition of gender and gender identity apart from bodily sex. Second set of questions. What does it even mean to have an internal sense of gender? What does gender feel like? Apart from a body, what meaning can we give to the concept of sex or gender? And thus, what internal sense can we have of gender? Let me make this a little more concrete. Apart from having a male body, what does it feel like to be a man? Apart from having a female body, what does it feel like to be a woman? Or to ratchet it up just a little bit more, what does it feel like to be both a man and a woman? Or to be neither? Remember, the gender unicorn and the gender-bred person say you can be male, female, both, neither, or something else. So this is an epistemological concern. How would we know? How do we have access to the knowledge of what it is to feel like a man or a woman, apart from being a man or a woman or having a male's body? How would I know what it is to feel like a woman? How do I even know what it's like to feel like a man? I imagine all of the men in this room have different feelings. But what unites us is that we have the same type of body. Another set of concerns, these are more ontological. Why should feeling like a man, whatever that is, make someone a man? That is, why do our feelings determine the reality on sex, but on little to nothing else? After our feelings don't determine our age or our height, and very few are the activists who went along with Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who identifies as black. So if someone who identifies as transgender is the sex with which they identify, why isn't someone the race with which they identify? And what about people who identify as animals and transabled people, people who are able-bodied but identify as disabled? Do all of these identities determine reality? And should all of these people receive medical treatments to transform their bodies into alignment with their minds? Species reassignment surgery for trans species people, amputations for transabled people. Why embrace transgender reality, but not transracial or trans species or transabled reality? Why don't we say beliefs always determine reality? So gender identity can sound a lot like religion, religious identity. And what I mean by that is that here we have beliefs that shape identities, identities that are determined by beliefs. But just like religion, the identities and the beliefs don't determine reality. Someone who identifies as a Christian believes that Jesus is the Christ. Someone who identifies as a Muslim believes that Muhammad is the prophet. But Jesus either is or is not the Christ, and Muhammad either is or is not the prophet, regardless of what any of us happen to believe. And so too, a person either is or is not a man, regardless of what anyone, including that person, him or herself, happens to believe. And so the challenge for transgender activists is to offer an argument for why transgender beliefs determine reality, when all of our other beliefs are supposed to conform to reality. I wasn't here last night, but the basic gist, as I understand it, of Robbie's talk last night is that the point of a liberal arts education is to liberate us to conform to the truth. Rather than a despotism of our emotions and feelings, the point of being well-educated and to being well-formed is to align our beliefs and our actions with reality. Why is that not the case on this issue? I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that this is not going well from a time management perspective. But I don't want to cut out this next session because this next section that I want to talk about are people who have been victimized by transgender activists, the victims of our transgender moment. And this was the chapter of the book that was most difficult to research and write. These are people who have transitioned and then detransitioned. So what I do in the book is I tell the stories of several people who found that transitioning, while it went well as a cosmetic matter and might have brought immediate sense of relief, it didn't actually bring the peace and the wholeness that they were looking for, but it only brought new problems. And so the stories of the detransitioners complicate the sunny picture that is frequently presented in the media. Many of these people recall feeling pressured into transitioning as if it was their only real option. And they wish that medical professionals had explored the underlying psychological issues that alienated them from their bodies. Many of these people regret the permanent damage done, and some who transitioned as teenagers feel that they were much too young to be making irreversible, life-altering decisions. Some feel that their gender dysphoria resulted from social hostility to people like them, people with same-sex attractions or people who are gender nonconforming. And so that should prompt a social conservative like me to be careful not to attack or marginalize people as we defend and advocate for the truth. But by the same token, we should also insist that trans activists cease attacking and marginalizing detransitioners. On October 1st of this year, so just 4 weeks ago, The Telegraph in the United Kingdom, a UK newspaper, ran a report with this headline, quote, "Sex change regret. Gender reversal surgery is on the rise, so why aren't we talking about it?" And the answer to that question is political correctness. But it's better to be correct than politically correct when human lives are at stake. All right, so I want to read you three quotes from some of the, I went through and I watched a bunch of YouTube videos of people who have detransitioned and read a bunch of the blogs. And these are stories that you will never hear on the mainstream media. These people will not be given a 2-hour special Friday night on 2020 with Diane Sawyer, the way that Bruce Jenner, as he was then called, was. To find out these people's stories, you actually have to go digging on the web. So here's one. I'm going to read you 3 different excerpts from this person's testimony. "I was put on hormones after 3 months of therapy at the age of 17. In fact, because I was only seeing a therapist once per month, it was after 3 or 4 visits that I was prescribed testosterone, with no meaningful attempt made to process the issues that I brought up that led in part to my wish to transition. When I was transitioning, no one in the medical or psychological field ever tried to dissuade me, to offer other options, to do really anything to stop me besides telling me I should wait till I was 18. I want to ask you, how many other medical conditions are there where you can walk into a doctor's office, tell them that you have a certain condition, which has no objective test, which can be caused by trauma or mental health issues or societal factors, and receive life-altering medications on your say-so?" She continues, "I think the prospect of completely changing your body, your life, your identity is very compelling to a teenager who is just learning to cope with mental health issues, with trauma, with gender nonconformance, with being a lesbian. And that's especially true when the current rhetoric around transition really discourages any kind of questioning. It really frames transitioning or trans identity as the solution to any kind of gender issue or gender confusion. And I think it's really important for therapists not to frame transition as the only solution, to really present options, and to encourage people not to take their feelings and urges entirely at face value, to be critical, to really think about where those thoughts are coming from." And the last quote. "I wanted to make a video previously so that folks can see that I'm a real live person, but didn't out of fear of showing my face. But I think it's important when we talk about these issues to really understand that women like us aren't just statistics, not just some dry data some gatekeeping doctor might throw at you. We're real people. This is the real outcome of transition. I'm a real live 22-year-old woman with a scarred chest and a broken voice and 5 o'clock shadow because I couldn't face the idea of growing up to be a woman. That's my reality." So, I still get choked up reading these things out loud. This is what's at stake in these discussions. So some people sometimes ask, like me and Sharif, like, why do you guys do this? Because we don't get very much fan mail. And it's not helping our careers. Sharif will not be the next McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University, even though he should. It's partly because of these outcomes. And what's taken place in the past 10 years is something that was once unthinkable has now become mainstreamed And anyone who is questioning it is at risk of losing their jobs. I had several non-tenured professors helping me with the research on this book because they couldn't do it in their own voice under their own name because they would lose their jobs. These are people at mainstream medical schools, mainstream universities, and they have many colleagues like them. There are a few professors who have spoken out, and they tell me that their most frequent interaction is from colleagues who come in their office, shut the door, and say, "Thank you so much for doing this. Don't tell anyone I came here." That's the situation on campus right now. Many people think what's going on. We have rushed headlong into social experiments on children, but if they say it out loud, they risk professional ruin. All right, so in the time I have left, I want to go through a couple of steps of how to think about some of the realities. I've tried to show you what the activists think, some of the tensions in the activist worldview, some of the consequences for the people's lives who have really been harmed by these ideologies. Let me start by saying sex reassignment procedures produce these bad outcomes for people, partly because they're impossible. Sex change is metaphysically impossible because it's biologically impossible. And so to understand why the reassignment approach is so misguided, we need to understand the biology and philosophy of sex in the first place. We need to understand what it means to be a sexually dimorphic species. We need to understand how our development as male and female begins at conception, progresses through our time in the womb, continues a little bit after birth, and then recommences in a very forceful way at puberty. And we need to understand the many biological differences that result. Contrary to the claims of activists, sex is not assigned at birth. It's a bodily reality that most people can recognize on a grainy ultrasound video, which is why when you see many people posting on Facebook with a grainy ultrasound video saying, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl," they didn't assign that sex to that child. They were using imaging technology to reveal something that's true to the child. Now, what determines sex in all mammalian species is our organization for reproduction. The way to understand any organism is that organisms are a collection of organs that are organized in certain ways. So the human organism differs from the canine organism, differs from the bovine organism, and that all of our various organs are organized differently if you're a human than if you're a dog, than if you're a cow. But we're all integrated unities of various complex systems. And so you can think we have a reproductive system, we have a cardiovascular system, we have a respiratory system. The way in which we both coherently understand what it is to be a man and a woman and readily identify who is a man and a woman is based on the organism's organization for reproduction. Sex is a biological, bodily reality, not based on gender stereotypes, who likes the color pink and who likes the color blue, not based on kind of societal expectations, who should be a chemist and who should be a ballet performer, based on these bodily realities. So sex, in terms of male and female, is identified in the organization of an organism for sexually reproductive acts. This is why no one has trouble identifying male and female dogs, male and female cows, even without knowing what their gender identity is. So it's remarkable that Professor Atkins at Duke would say that it's contrary to medical science to look at chromosomes or internal reproductive organs or external genitalia or hormones or anything else. It just strikes me that's what medical science does all the time in every other mammalian species. And if I understand what Ashley said in the last session correctly, if you now understand what most medical doctors understand, how various drugs and diseases affect the male and the female body differently, it strikes me that what we really want to know is the sex of the patient, not the gender identity of the patient when we're prescribing a drug. The dosage that is appropriate of a certain pharmaceutical for a male is a dosage that is appropriate based upon their body, not upon their identity. And so you wouldn't want, it's not contrary to medical science to actually be asking about the reality here. So sex in terms of male and females, based upon their organization. So sex as a status, male and female, is a recognition of the organization of a body that can engage in sex as an action, and how it is that that body engages in sex as an action. Males are organized to engage in sexual acts in which they donate genetic material. Females organized to engage in sexual acts in which they receive genetic material and then have the ability to gestate offspring. This is the fundamental distinction and the only coherent way of even thinking about the distinction between male and female. This primary difference then gives rise to a whole host of secondary differences. This is the difference in terms of body size and shape, in terms of bone density and musculature, in terms of brain differences, in terms of heart disease and stress and perceptual differences. And all of those differences are distributional. You'll have two distribution curves, they overlap. The distribution curve will be different on every feature that we could examine. So you may, I wish I had created another graph to put on a slide, but you may be at one point on a kind of distribution curve for bone density or musculature or height or weight, and a different point for a different characteristic. You may be more stereotypically masculine or feminine on any one of these given characteristics, but that's because those aren't what define us as male and female. Those are some of the biological bodily consequences of being organized in a female way, where your second X chromosome directs your body to develop in a distinctively female way in which estrogen will feminize your body, or the presence of a Y chromosome with the SRY gene on it that will direct your body to develop in a masculine way and then have testosterone masculinize your body. Those are the kind of essential differences. Now, there are various disorders of sexual development. There's an acronym DSD, both genetic and hormonal causes in which people can develop in a disordered way with respect to their sexual capacities. So you can be an X nothing female, where you simply lack a second sex chromosome. This is known as Turner syndrome. And these women, they develop as, from an external perspective, ordinary, normal women, but they're infertile. Because without the second X chromosome, they lack the genetic material to develop fully functioning ovaries. This can also happen to an XY man who doesn't have the SRY gene on his Y chromosome. So for those of you who are biologists, those of you who took high school biology, think about how you can have crossover during mitosis and meiosis. If that gene is translocated on the X sex chromosome instead of the Y, you might have a Y chromosome, but it's not a fully functional Y chromosome. So you will develop, to all observers, to be an infertile woman because you never have the gene that commences masculine development. And it's this SRY gene that is normally on the Y chromosome that initiates this. You could have the XY chromosomal set with the SRY gene on your Y chromosome, but not develop as a man, again, develop as an infertile female, because you lack the receptor to androgen. So your body has the gene that starts the production of testosterone, but your body has what's known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which it can't respond to androgen, to testosterone. And so you'll develop largely as a woman. So there are all sorts of intersex conditions, what used to be known as hermaphrodites, what's properly understood in the medical science as disorders of sexual development. And they have virtually nothing to do with gender identity discussions or with transgender identities. These people identify as who they are. They simply show us that it's a slightly more complicated picture than just saying XX and XY. You actually need to understand how it is that XX and XY commence the development of male and female bodies and how it can go wrong in various ways. So they're known as disorders of sexual development, just like we have cardiac disorders and heart disease, we have respiratory disorders and lung disease. They're now attempting, these are the activists, to redefine disorders of sexual development as differences of sexual development, in an attempt to suggest that there's no such thing as ordered development. If you can't have a disorder of sexual development, that's because there's no such thing as an ordered way of development with respect to sexuality. which we would never do on any other aspect of healthcare. We don't say there are differences of cardiac development. We correctly identify them as cardiac disorders and heart diseases. But they're trying here to say that this is all subjective and it's all on a fluid spectrum, rather than identifying what the two, and this is 99.9% of people develop ordinarily in these two ways. But there is a small fraction of people who either will, because of genetic or hormonal reasons, will have a disorder or development, which medical science can frequently address. And it's important in many of these cases for medical science to address it. So if that's some of the science on how to think about this, the medicine follows from it. The basic gist here is that we shouldn't try to do the impossible. The appropriate therapeutic response to someone with a gender identity conflict is not a misguided attempt to transform the body to conform it to the mind, but an attempt to help the mind and the feelings be comfortable in the body. Many of the psychologists and psychiatrists who have published on this and who I've spoken with, they draw a comparison to anorexia, in which people can have false assumptions about their own body. They can have feelings that are out of whack with reality, where they think or feel that they are fat, that they're obese, that they're not pretty enough. And they think the solution is to starve themselves in various ways, to stop eating, in some cases with bulimia, to purge themselves. And no one suggests that the appropriate medical treatment to anorexia is liposuction. No one would suggest that. People who have body integrity identity disorder, where they have phantom limbs or where they want to have limbs removed, no one suggests the appropriate therapy is to actually remove those limbs for people who want to be transabled. Why on this issue are we allowing the mind to determine reality, rather than counseling people in ways of helping them identify and be comfortable with reality? What I do in the book is I go through several case studies, particularly of children, because it's really interesting. I mentioned that statistic. 80 to 95% of children will naturally come to identify with their body if they're just allowed to continue to develop. 100% of the children who have been placed on puberty blockers in the studies, so this isn't 100% of all children, but 100% of the children who have been part of the clinical studies persisted in their transgender identity. So whereas ordinarily 80 to 95% of those children would have desisted, they would have grown out of their gender dysphoria, 100% of the children who were placed on puberty blockers persisted in their transgender identity. This has raised the concern that one of the things that puberty blockers do is that they lock in a transgender identity. That going through puberty in the right body could actually be one of the ways in which a child experiencing gender dysphoria more readily identifies with their body. If you're a boy who identifies as a girl, going through puberty as a boy with that rush of testosterone might help you more readily identify as a boy, and vice versa for a girl. Part of this is the reality of neuroplasticity. All of our brains are constantly rewiring themselves, and I know previous speakers at this conference have focused on this concept with respect to porn addictions and the way in which looking at pornography can rewire the brain. Neuroplasticity is especially true with children. The developing brain is very plastic, and so our thoughts and our feelings and our actions rewire our brain. They lay down certain neural pathways, stimulus and response. And so if you lock this in, you can be making it that harder to have someone come out of it. In addition, these puberty blockers, they're not safe. They have known risks in terms of bone disease, in terms of stroke, heart disease, things like that. But also not only do we have no idea if they're reversible, to even suggest that they're reversible simply gets biology wrong. Going through puberty at age 18, when you were supposed to have gone through it at 10, 11, 12, is not reversing puberty blocking. It's delaying it by 7, 8, 9 years. So even if it is the case that when you stop administering puberty blocking drugs, puberty would recommence, to go through a developmental process a decade late is not reversing this intervention. 5 years ago, get to Q&A. All right, we're going to wrap this up. 5 years ago, the Washington Post ran a story about a child who was transitioning. And this is what the Washington Post said. Children have been openly transitioning genders for probably less than a decade in the United States. There is very little to go on scientifically to support that approach, and the very idea of labeling young children as transgender is shocking to many people. What the Post said 5 years ago is still true today. There's very little to go on scientifically to support this approach, and it should be shocking to many people. The best therapies are directed at understanding why the child is experiencing the dysphoria. So I'll close by saying sometimes it has to do with the child's experiences. They're being bullied by other boys at school. They're not a very rough and tumble boy, so they start hanging out with other girls. They develop other stereotypically feminine interests, and they come to believe that they're a girl. Sometimes it's connected with autism, in which students have a very rigid understanding of many parts of the world, including gender. And so they think that because I play with trucks, I must be a boy, even though they're a girl. Sometimes it has to do with trauma to the parents. One of the case studies involved a mother who had been raped as a teenager or 20-something. She developed an antipathy towards men. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl. She was much more affectionate with her daughter than with her son. Her son picked up on this. And that's why he started identifying as a girl to try to win over his mother's affection. And it was in the context of family therapy that when the therapist finally addressed the mother's unresolved trauma, that boy, within a year, went back to identifying as a boy. These are the children that, if they were to go to the gender clinic at Duke, would be advised, because they're persistent, insistent, and consistent, to be given puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. These are the children who, when they're 22, may make that YouTube video that I read to you. So with that, I'm going to stop. I apologize for going longer.